Well, welcome. We may have a few more people dialing in. I've heard from a couple other people that are there planning to join, but prefer to get started and not penalize those of us who are here with silence and boredom. So we'll get rolling. Quick introduction / review on these calls are just entirely an opportunity for L3 community members to get together to discuss what you're learning, what you're getting out of the month. We tend to focus these calls around the theme of the month or the various content that's coming out weekly in the content channel and create an opportunity for some additional discussion and interaction around that stuff. But it's certainly not limited to that. We're just basically, these calls are a monthly opportunity for the community to connect and engage live. So oftentimes they will hair off in random directions, and that's perfectly fine as long as everybody's engaging and getting something good out of it. So it's very much a make of it what you will, bring your own thoughts and questions and discussion to the process, as we don't have a set agenda for the call tonight. We'll kick things off with some questions and stuff, but yeah, just an encouragement for everybody to yeah, pitch in with your questions and just sharing kind of what the month has been for you, what you've been learning from it. Because again, one of our central paradigms on the L3 platform is that we learn best when we're engaging each other, learning from each other's journeys and experiences and so on. So we definitely want to take the opportunity to do that. One or two little quick logistical things for L3 members, more just L3 platform in general. One is, interestingly, the Mighty Networks, which is the platform that we have transitioned to, released a navigation and layout change, I think today or late yesterday. Don't know exactly when that went live, but poke around and check that out if you haven't. They've kind of consolidated some of the navigation stuff in kind of a left bar and just done some reorganization. And I think the basic layout is the same, but I think it makes it just that extra little bit more navigable, extra little bit more easy to kind of find what you're looking for and so on, which is really nice. And one of the features that they have added, which Dad, you'll be happy to hear about this, is that we can now create courses or organize content sequences directly in the platform. They've added that functionality. So I'll be using that to actually create, coming up here probably in June, a more well fleshed out orientation course that kind of walks through how to use the platform, both kind of the psychology or the philosophy of how to engage the community, and also a lot of the practical stuff of kind of technically how to make the most of the platform. And that will actually be like a course that we can just embed directly in there. But I'm thinking of some ideas, and we're talking about some ideas for some other ways that we can utilize that feature to, just to kind of create some additional, more focused ways of people engaging certain processes or concepts and so on. So I think that's going to be a cool, neat addition. So check that out. It's actually been a really great and very active month. There's a lot of stuff, good stuff. And we're starting to hit that critical mass where just sort of scrolling through the recent activity log is not necessarily the best way to find everything because stuff moves down faster. So just a reminder, I personally think that one of the best ways to kind of explore and engage the actual content platform, the actual L3 platform, is to go look either by topic or by channel, find things that interest you. So find a topic that interests you or a channel theme that interests you and go directly into that, pull that up, and then that kind of gives you more of a snapshot of some activity in the network, and it's a great way to find things that you may have otherwise missed because it rolled through the recent activity field before, in between your visits. So just a reminder for everybody to take advantage of some of those navigation and filtering options. Don't just show up, look at what's on the page and the first three things on the page and think that's all there is, because we're hitting that point now where that won't probably be the best way to find what's there, and you're missing some cool stuff that way.
Hey,
so.
Justin, can I add a helpful tip from me? Because I'm a member of almost all of the channels and topics because I'm interested in everything and everybody. It would take a long time to scroll through all of those. So what I'm finding is another simple way to just know what all has gone on. There's the little icon, the communication icon up on the right hand corner.
Mm-hmm.
Always has a listing of everything new that's happened that is related to me, that is in
Right.
things that I'm active in.
Right.
And so I've been going up to that and then
Yeah.
just tracking all of the different responses or posts or whatever
Mm-hmm.
anybody's done that would
Yeah.
be relevant to me that way. That way I'm sure at least I'm tracking those things.
Yep. That's a great way to keep on top of like additions or further comments in conversations you're already a part of,
Yeah.
or in responses to things that are yours. It's not 100% foolproof in the sense of telling if you're following a person and they post something, then you'll get a message about it. So that's another reason. And again, there's
Okay.
information about that in the guide, but I'll be doing a more thorough feature when we put together the orientation course about following people or following discussion threads so that you get specific notifications. But it won't give you notifications just because there's content in a channel that you're tracking per se. That is you're right. That's the best way to keep tabs on what stuff has been going on, that's either like replies to or comments on some things that you've posted, or respond if you've posted to something else and then someone else replies, it'll give you a notification. So that's a really handy feature to keep an eye on, because that will definitely clue you into sort of the most relevant activity to you. But especially for people who haven't been on in a little while, that might not be bringing back a ton of results that
Sure.
are actually tuning them to things that are current, because they
Sure.
haven't been interacting with that stuff. So
Right.
also a great idea to just go through, pull up the channels list or pull up the topics list, click into a handful of those, and that will show you more of like a curated look at what's going on and what people have been saying and doing and discussing and so on. So that's another great just kind of way to do that. And that is only going to increase. The second little piece of news, business news, informational news, we are gearing up for June to be a much more expanded launch process for the platform, including reaching out to and kind of trying to draw in people from outside the GDI network, which is not something that we've done before. We're going to be running a really cool free kind of focused learning process that's going to be really a great resource for people to kind of really engage with the fundamentals of a learning posture and what some of those key principles are. I think it's going to be really helpful for a lot of people. So I'll just say that for now, but just to give you guys a heads up that that's going to be happening throughout June and especially toward the end of June. So keep an eye out for that. That's something you can share with people, take advantage of yourself, and also keep an eye out, because as we do that, that should be bringing in kind of a new influx of people, including people that you probably don't know or have never met because they're even from outside the GDI network. So keep an eye out for opportunities to connect, because there's going to be some really cool pockets of people that we're going to be tapping into and drawing on. There's going to be some very, I think, fun, high caliber people coming into the community. So keep an eye out for that, and reach out to people and follow up with people and connect with them as that happens. And also, hey, Matt, also just be tracking that that's going to be happening here over the next couple of weeks, and you'll be getting more specific information about that as that goes through. Cool. All right. So enough business. Time for pleasure. Yes. So as I said, this is open discussion time. The thematic focus that we've been on in terms of the regular weekly content channel was the input series that I did on discerning, receiving, pursuing a call, and the idea of call. How do we think about that? And so engaging with that concept by looking at the story of Gideon in Judges as kind of a really helpful model that we can draw a lot of information out of. So those videos are all still up, and one of the lovely things about the way the content channel works is all of the content is all there and will always be there, so you can always go back and re-engage or rewatch any of that stuff. But that's been our focus for May. So for kicking things off, at least, I wanted to start with some discussion around that, around some of those concepts and paradigms and just some of the principles there. So let's kick things off with Dad, well, actually, let me ask this. For those who are specifically on the call, can you guys let me know and on whether or not you've been able to watch any of those or some of those or any of those? Because if not, I can do a super quick summary so that we have some of the same, we're on some of the same page. I know Matt and Joanna, I know you guys haven't even joined the platform. So obviously that's probably not something you've had a chance to do. And Adam, I think you're just getting plugged in here this month as well. Dad, do you think, does that sound good? Would that be good for me to do?
Yeah, probably be essential at this point.
Okay.
And also, I mean, there'll be people listening to this recording, and since we don't know, who all has been through the material, and if so, how much, go ahead and just give us a little backdrop.
Yep. Yep. I'll do the short version. Obviously, the videos are all there for more detail. But basically, as I was looking at this Gideon's story, which is one of my favorites, he's one of my favorite kind of biblical characters, started to kind of see this more concrete pattern or process that I am convinced is actually kind of a kingdom way, a kingdom process that kind of God takes us through, or that's fairly consistent for the way that we are first kind of introduced to and receive a call and then walk it out to completion. And so I think that's a pretty relevant topic because it's something that all of us, I think, at various times in our lives are invited to do. So the first thing I think that's important is I proposed a definition of call that's a little bit more practical and, in a sense, kind of zoomed in, because so often when we hear this word, right, in church culture, it's commonly discussed that God has a call for you or plan for your life, or what's the call of God on your life, and it's usually used in the singular, like the call of God on your life, as though there's this kind of universal, singular, abstracted destination that you're supposed to hit, and sort of by the end of your life, you're supposed to be able to say whether you achieved the call or not the call. And I think that sometimes that level of singularness is not helpful, because I think that actually we are invited to engage multiple calls, at least the way that I'm proposing to define it, over the course of our life in multiple seasons. So the way I was defining it for the purpose of this kind of series, so that we can have some common definition, is that a call is anytime something that is on your heart or gets on your radar or kind of grabs your attention, and that is also on God's heart, kind of meet in the middle, and God then gives the invitation and says, hey, I'm glad to see that you're noticing that problem or that need or that opportunity, and now I care about that, I notice it, so now I'm inviting you to engage me, and let's together do something about that. Kind of that simple. So kind of that could be anything from, a decade-long process to launch an organization. But I'm personally becoming more convinced that could be as simple as something that is even more focused and seasonal. Kind of anything that falls under that heading, I think, is a helpful way of thinking about call, because that puts it in a more practical and proactive footing for us to think about, what does that look like? What am I looking for? And so then working from that definition, going through the story of Gideon kind of broke down that the process of walking through a call breaks down into kind of 3 distinct phases that God moves us through. The first one being receiving the call, which is all about kind of what I just said, that point when God gets our attention, puts something on our heart. And the thing that's really pertinent about that, if you look at Gideon's story, is that there's some great language there where he's basically saying, I am not the right person for the job. I'm the least of my family, which is the least of my tribe. Like, I have nothing to offer here. Why are you even bringing this up? Feeling completely disqualified, but feeling passionate about the thing. Like, he obviously cared very much about saving his people, but feeling totally disqualified. And that being contrasted with the way that God is talking to him, which is, he greets him as, hail, mighty warrior, the Lord is with you. So there's this awesome contrast that's set up right from the beginning, where essentially at the beginning of the call, God sees in us some things that he wants to activate through a process, and it's inviting us into engaging him in that that those things then get refined and brought out in us. So receiving the call is all about saying yes and launching in despite feeling qualified or ready. Moves into the middle phase, which is all about testing the call, where there's a process where the kind of disorientation and overwhelm of the thing that we are trying to engage leads us back into relationship with God and engaging him relationally, bringing our doubts and our questions and our asking for our fleeces and that kind of part of the story. And then testing the call and actually engaging that process well gives us the confidence to embrace what God invites us to do that makes no sense, the things that feel totally irrational, or that he's inviting us into engaging the process in ways that don't line up with our expectations. Because we test it well, that actually puts us on a footing where we can say yes, even though those things are really scary and overwhelming, which moves us into the final stage, which is all about pursuing the call. And that's all the stuff in the story that we're usually more familiar with, where God winnows his army down to just 300 guys, and there's torches and trumpets, and they do the thing. But all the way along, what was so striking to me about the story is that at each point along the way, God's invitation to Gideon wasn't to get it right or to even really know what he was doing per se. It was to be faithful to say yes and take the step that was in front of him and engage what was right in front of him right now. So, he summoned the army before he had the plan and felt like it was going to work. And then he takes the steps to winnow it down, even though he feels like this is the exact opposite of what we should. So at each point along the way, it was really encouraging to me to put it in a more human context, where doubt and confusion and not knowing where we're headed is not a disqualifier that somehow means now you're no longer the guy for the job or the woman for the job, and God's irritated at you for not having your act together. But it's actually the exact opposite. So that's a super short, well, not super short, as short as I can manage version of for like 25-minute videos, for 3 or 4. So if you can go back and watch those for more specific details and kind of the nuances and stuff. But that's kind of the basic premise of what we're talking about. So I'm going to stop talking now. We can open up for general discussion around that concept. I personally, I would love to hear that definition of call. Does that resonate? Does that seem on point, useful, totally off the wall? And then kind of, I'd also, with one of the things I would love to discuss, so to throw it out as a question, is looking at maybe specific examples of, as we start thinking about this as a paradigm, a way of understanding kind of one of the ways of God, looking back then on our lives, are there examples we can think of retroactively of like, oh, hey, you know what, actually that thing that was going on in my life at that point really does track well, and this kind of gives me some interesting perspective on that season from 10 years ago where X, Y, and Z was happening, or what have you. Because I think getting practical is also helpful. So opening up the floor, questions for further investigation, thoughts, observations, and so on.
Amber, you weren't here when we asked if people had watched the videos. Have you seen, did you see any of them?
I saw the first and most of the second.
Okay, good. Yeah.
Yep.
Copes, were you attempting to respond before I interrupted you?
All right, if you guys can hear us, sorry we were late. We were operating off of a previous incorrect number, but happy to be here. Good to see all of you guys.
Yeah, welcome.
Hello again, Doug. Yeah, Justin, we've not had a chance to really formally meet, but really appreciate the the time being here. So I'll jump in and say I would say that very much resonated with me. Number one, just the definition of calling not necessarily being this giant thing like it's the only one calling you will ever have and that's it, but it can be moments and seasons. And so I that very much did resonate with me, and also really appreciate hearing about the the Gideon story, about how, hey, God may not necessarily give you all the tools all at once so you feel necessarily prepared, but just the first step of faith is taking the first step down the path, trusting that you'll be provided the tools that you need. So I really did appreciate that. And so I have nothing to add other than like, sounds good, brother. I'm on board. That makes it less scary.
And I just wanted to chirp in and say that this morning I woke up with some verses on my heart, and winnowing actually came up as one of the words. And so that Matt was like, what does that mean? And so we had that conversation about what that is. And so even just that affirming, to help us cue in with what's going on in the picture that you're painting. And certainly, definitely the God that I know is the major call to relationship. And then all these calls along the way of conversation that more feel like an engagement of intimacy. So absolutely. Yes.
That's awesome.
I know when I was listening through the series, Justin, one of the things that struck me that you picked up on that I had never quite seen in that story before was the language that exists out there in, kind of in the church, at least in kind of evangelical circles, would be, the idea of the fleece being, it's like the fleece, you use a fleece to test when you're not sure, when you're deciding, whether it's God or not, or whether you want to respond or whether you want to commit. That's really the way we use the fleece language out there, or whether it's the way it's largely used. But as you pointed out, that's not what the story is about, because he actually responds to God and essentially commits and sets in motion.
Right.
And then in the process, once he's in motion, once he's already essentially committed, then the fleece thing comes in. It's, kind of later in the process, which is really an interesting twist, because I think often what happens is we don't know what to do with ourselves when either we tend to say, well, I'm going to wait until I get it all, until I'm sure, which means then we do a lot of waiting in our lives, right? Because who can ever be that sure? Or we set in motion and then questions hit us, or doubts, or something like we need something from, and then we beat ourselves up for like, I shouldn't need this because I've committed. So anyway, there was something very powerful about sequencing the story accurately and recognizing the place that the fleece component played in that story. And essentially, as you pointed out, God seemed to be fine with that. He's like, okay, cool, we'll do this.
Yeah.
And the fact that Gideon stayed with it and wrestled with it and was honest about his questions, even after he was in motion, even after he was committed, was in fact the thing that eventually did give him the clarity and the certainty that he really needed to draw on and act on when the chip, when the pressure was on later on.
Right.
So it was just, that was a whole different take on that story than I'd seen.
Yeah. I think that was probably the part that struck me the most as well. Just that idea that, so he's already got like 30,000 men assembling, and he's spending his days, leading the army, the logistics, the training, all the stuff. It's at night when he's kind of alone with God, and that's where he's kind of wrestling out his doubts and how he's feeling about stuff. But it was just it was a great picture of, it wasn't like, well, God, prove yourself to me and then I'll do whatever. Like, give me what I'm looking for so that I can trust you. It was, everything's already like on the line. His life was on the line. His reputation was on the line. Like, there was it was, wow, I'm freaking out. And he and God very graciously engaging with him. They were engaging relationally around Gideon's like honest kind of bringing how he's doing into the discussion with God. But it was very much like a gift that God was giving him, or a confidence that he was giving him in the process, not a, let me get my checklist sorted out before I decide if I want to be in on this or not, which you're right, is usually how, at least I've always heard that metaphor used, is like, well, you use a fleece to like test whether it's real or not. I thought that was really cool. And seeing that sequence that way was, for me, very comforting, very encouraging. That like the fact that it was already in motion and here's how he's doing internally was obviously not a disqualifier. Like, God was okay with it. It was fine. It wasn't like, well, I guess you're a weenie, so we're gonna have to find somebody else. You know, I found that really nice.
Hey, well, I'm sorry I just kind of found out about this about half an hour ago, so I didn't get to watch all your input content at all. But I do have a couple of comments. First of all, I think it'd be interesting. I wonder if anybody is familiar with Tony Stoltzfus's work in The Calling Journey, because he really does a huge differentiation between doing call and being call. And what you've just described here it sounds a lot more to me like the doing call portion of it. And, you know, and I'm reflecting on our own process right now of discerning, you know, should we take the family to spend a year in Egypt? Well, that's a year. That's not my whole life. And it, you know, even if we do decide to go ahead and do it, we're not going to be in Egypt forever. Not unlike Joseph or Jesus. So, so I think there's an interesting differentiation there, but what you're talking about does kind of soften the weight of discerning these doing calls that are, there's like a series of them in our lives. And then as you guys were talking about the fleeces, I had just grabbed my Bible here and looked, because I was like, wasn't there something he kind of messed up at the end? And it's interesting that it says that he got this 1,700 shekels of gold and some odds and ends, and then he made it into an ephod. And I just realized for the first time in my life that isn't the ephod the thing that you keep the Urim and Thummim in, which would be basically a yes-no fleece type of trinket. And then it says Israel played the harlot with it there. So there's a caution, it seems like, to this whole fleece of like, can we do a yes-no, a Ouija board, you know, can we play this little dice game to see if, you know, that it sounds like there's a caution there of how you use that, how you discern when it's a good time to, you know, kind of roll the dice, pull a straw, or whatever. So I thought that was interesting. I've never really figured out, okay, why an ephod? Oh, because he's got this pattern in his life of like trying to discern with fleeces. And it doesn't really say that he shouldn't have done it, because I think maybe he had probably figured out how to use that pattern in a healthy way. But then other people were like, oh, Gideon's got an ephod, maybe we'll just go, you know, consult the oracle, basically, and do it in a way that wasn't healthy.
Yeah.
That's just totally off the top of my head just now, but I think I'm curious. So I may be completely wrong about that, but I wonder if anybody else has ever seen that.
Yeah. One of the things that I talked about a little bit in the final video, the third video, is the idea that as we're exiting a call, or after it, like, okay, it's been accomplished, like mission accomplished, there's a stewardship question that then gets raised about how we exit the call well, to position ourselves for whatever God has next, and to kind of to carry on from, like, to remember what happened well, but also not kind of idolize it, or get like, you know, rooted in your glory days, where like that thing that happened that I did that was important, that's me now, that's all, and you know, you can, you know, like, I think we can all think of people who kind of, it's a little bit that sense of like, yeah, you know, back in that day when I was doing important stuff, and it's kind of like that's where they're still living a little bit. At least that was one of the things I took away from the story, that at that exit, that like he has this really good thing, and the scriptures kind of, it's clear that like he did other stuff after that, but there was in my Bible, the verse is like that it was a stumbling block for Gideon and his family. So there's this sense of somehow, some way of what, and I don't think it was the thing itself, I think it was what it represented to him, of what he took away from it, that actually became a hindrance for what God had next. I think there's always something that God has next. So I thought I think you're right. I think there's some interesting insights in there about what does it look like to end a call well and then steward that well, and then what's next after that. But yeah, I think there's some interesting stuff there as well.
Can you hear me? This is Danny.
Yeah, I can hear you, Danny.
Great. I'm back in. I had one thought about your just hearing you and Doug and the interchange going back to the testing and the fleece thing. That how much of this story is by faith? I listened to the first calling video and wasn't able to get to the other ones. But even hearing you talk about the testing now, and even the pursuing, how much of that fleece thing happened as a result of faith, rather than I think our typical cultural explanation of Gideon's lack of faith. I just went, as you guys are talking about it, I just went back and read that little snippet of, well, what made him decide that? And he called the tribes together to come and fight. And then after calling them, said, oh God, the way I read it was, the fleece is, am I going to die? Is
right.
This, are we not, have you called us to do this thing?
Right.
Yes, you've called us to do it. How's this going to go for me?
How screwed are we?
Yeah. And because up until that point, I'm just thinking about Gideon, threshing the wheat in the winepress. I mean, they were screwed up until that point. And, who knew if Gideon was going to make it through? Anyway, just all that to say, I think Jill and I, in our journey too, so much of this is only by faith.
Yeah.
It's only by faith that we make progress in this life. And after listening to your calling video, the emphasis there was, oh my gosh, the faith of receiving the call, and then now the testing by faith. And then the part I've been reflecting on today is Gideon, and when the guy God says to him, if you're scared, go up into the camp, and he goes up into the camp.
That's such a great line, isn't it? If you're scared.
I think God already knew that maybe there was still going on. Yeah, no, and Danny, I completely agree. I think for me, the more I prayed about it and was just reflecting on that story, what kept emerging for me was just this beautiful, just the kindness of God, because it's so clear that at the beginning of this process, God has a vision for something. He has a vision for something for Israel and for Gideon specifically. Like, he sees things that he knows are part of who Gideon is because he made him that way, that at the beginning of the story, Gideon is not living out those parts of who he is. He's hiding, he's in fear, but God made him to be this mighty warrior who's like the opposite of all these things. He knows that those things are there, but Gideon doesn't. And so right from the very beginning, it's like God sees these things and he has a plan to both accomplish something in the world externally and accomplish something internally in Gideon through that process. And then basically the whole story after that is just this continual process of kindness where God keeps engaging Gideon and giving him a way to take a step forward. And kind of like right from the beginning, it's like a small thing, and he gives him the where the angel does the thing and burns the food, and it's like, wow, now that was a moment. I feel like I can believe this, and then it's the fleece, and then it's this, and it's like God continually saying, it's okay, just come along with me one more step. We're gonna get there, essentially just to get Gideon to the point where his faith is able to say yes to the totally terrifying thing that God's inviting him to. But like all the way along, God knew where that was leading and what it was going to accomplish in him. I don't know. To me, it was just this awesome picture of God engaging. It's kind of like a parent. I mean, I'm in this stage right now where you're a parent kind of trying to get your kid to start taking steps and walking. And it's like, I know you're fine. If you fall, you're going to be fine. It's not that big a deal. You're fine. But like, you need to do this. And like, come on, you can, like, let me just like So right now it's I'll hold your hand and you can take little steps. And once you kind of got that down, then I'm going to, you know, because I had this kind of vision for where this is going for you. And I'm excited to see that happen. It was just, which totally turned the narrative of the story for me on its head compared to how I've typically heard it talked about, which is all about this guy who lacked faith, but God used him anyway or whatever.
Yep.
So I'm curious, as you're kind of mulling over the Gideon story, both what you have known before and what you're hearing through this process, application in terms of our own life callings. Are you seeing these patterns, these rhythms? Are you resonating with them personally? What are your observations about this kind of dynamic of call in your own lives and in our own lives? Anybody have kind of reflections from your own journey? I don't know if anyone's being called to anything where you're feeling maybe a little, I don't
know. Jill and I had an interesting experience yesterday. We were with the Culps in Williamsburg and Doug in walking around. And before we met up with Doug and Joanna and Matt, Jill and I have been actually talking about the story of Gideon unrelatedly to this series. Just kind of, it's been popping on our radar screen from another direction. And we walked into a shop like about half an hour before we met up with them. And after rehearsing the story of Gideon together earlier in the day, and we walk into one of these shops, it's like a book binding shop or something like that. And she goes, "Look, a fleece." And there were 2 fleeces hanging from the rafters in the shop. And Jill and I had been discussing the fleece thing and what does it mean and all this. And prior to this conversation today and kind of thinking in these ways, I would have thought about it in terms of questions we need to be asking God. Now I'm kind of re-altering that idea as we speak on this call, wondering if it's less about questions we need to be asking God and more about baby steps we need to be taking in the direction of the thing that he's saying. Take some steps in this direction and see what happens. So anyway, so this conversation's having some rubber meets the road in that way for me.
Yeah. I found it interesting, again, even in the little nuances of what the story is actually saying. A lot of times in scripture, especially in the Old Testament, the pattern is God says to the person, go and do this to get your sign. Like, go in the river and bathe. Go. Here's what I'm telling you to go and do to get the confirmation. What I found really interesting about this story is that it's actually not that way. It's the other way around. Gideon is the one that says, like, he still has to put out the fleece. Like, even that is a step he takes to say, all right, God, like, here's this thing that I'm doing, and I'm asking you to engage me in it. Which, again, I don't know, don't want to read too much into things, but I just found that interesting as compared to so many other Old Testament narratives where God comes to the person and says, take this step, do this thing. I'm telling you what to do to get the confirmation that I want to give you. But yeah, Danny, I think that's a good point. I think there's a lot there that I think is pertinent about moving forward and engaging God in the honesty of where our hearts are at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I could
go ahead, Adam.
Okay, well, I could address your question there a little bit, Doug. In the process of this discernment thing that we're on now, one of the things was just taking an exploration trip, which, we began to raise money for. And then the other thing was looking for a sending organization that would partner with us. And we started with one of the guys that was praying with me every week and said, hey, is your organization, is this something that would fit with you guys? And if not, let's just cross it right off the list quickly and move on. And he said, yeah, it's not really quite how we do things. So we moved on. We talked to like 4 or 5 different Mennonite organizations, and they all said no. And then a couple of people had referred us to another organization, but we didn't have any organic connections. So then we came back to the guy and said, okay, well, let's pray about how we develop some organic connections, or how can we, get connected here. And he said, I've been really wrestling with the Lord, because our organization has 2 key questions that are like core value questions. And he said, the first one is, what needs to be done? Which, we've been identifying for 2 years. And then he said, the second question is, why not? And I was like, whoa, that's powerful. I just spent, an entire hour with my coach a week before on the topic of why not, listing about a dozen why nots in my life, and significant enough conversation that I wrote them all down, and they're hanging on the board back here, and I love that, so I think the why not I think there might be something to the fleece concept of saying, okay, I see this needs to be done, and God, you're seeing that this needs to be done. And I know that you could do that with anybody. You really could raise up, anybody to go do this, but why not me? Why not me? And God's, and then you put a fleece out there, and God says, yeah, why not you? Or, no, I appreciate your willingness, but you don't need to. I've got another plan. And that's okay too, because what does God really want? He wants a willing heart, and so then that's so freeing to me, knowing that. And so the ultimate result was, the guy said, I've checked with organizational leaders, and with these questions weighing heavy on my heart in prayer, and asked them if we could explore some kind of a pilot program that's outside the box for our organization with you, because of these questions. And they gave him a green light. So now it's like,
wow, that's great.
Now we can explore, working with this organization, which was the first one we crossed off our list just because we didn't fit in the box.
Right.
But man, it's so powerful that they're asking those kinds of questions in determining whether or not to explore working with somebody, because that is, it strikes me as being quite godly somehow.
Yeah, I really like that. That's really cool. And what a great current present example. Thank you for showing that, of engaging stages of call, live in concert.
Well, and there will still be why nots as we go on an exploration trip, and maybe we'll find some why not, some reasons not to do it. And so I'm just recognizing, I think, too, what stage of the process you're in terms of deciding where to go forward, and where you're still exploring, and where you're actually making enough of a decision that it's time to put a plan in place.
Yep. That's awesome.
Matt, you started to say something earlier?
Yeah, well, first of all, Adam, we haven't met yet, but absolutely appreciate the why not question. I think that's a good one to add to the toolkit. So a couple of things, as Joanne and I were sort of chatting as you guys were talking, had resonated pretty strongly. And the first was, Justin, when you were talking about how, sort of that idea of that, who are the people who live in their past. And, I was struck by, like the old guy wearing his high school Letterman jacket around his hometown because he was the varsity, high school football star. And here he is in his 50s, and how sad that is. But about a year ago, I would say that was exactly where I was kind of hoping to be, where I think Joanna and I had felt like, hey, we've done it. We're capping off the sort of 20-year career. We've done our public service. We should, I can be happy with that. And it's time to kind of ride off into the sunset and be comfortable. And about a month into the riding off into the sunset, both her and I got this kind of independently of one another. God is sort of saying, hey, I'm absolutely not done with you. And, ratchet that back a little bit. And so really this last year has been this process of kind of going through of like, okay, well, wait a second. If I'm not done with this, with this service, what are you asking me to do? And it was a struggle for a lot of this year of, kind of feeling like doors were sort of opening in a certain direction that seemed pretty scary. And a few weeks ago, and this is the part I really wanted to maybe share with you guys, I was driving home and just praying about it, trying to find the right question that I feel like I could get an answer to, kind of like Graham Cook had talked about in one of his teachings. And so I was asking God, I'm like, God, I'm feeling this calling, like, it feels, and to me, the analogy was of this mountain. You're asking me to kind of climb this mountain. Like, are you asking me to do this right now? And I live in New England, and most of the time in New England, as you're driving around, you're surrounded by trees. And so as I sort of asked this question, I was driving up over a hill, and suddenly the trees opened up, and I could see way off in the distance, and there off in the distance was this mountain. And then just as soon as I got that glimpse of it, I went back down into the trees. And it felt like this very strong message that, like, hey, you are hearing this call, and you're going to be hearing this call, right now. And you're going towards this mountain, and you won't always see it, and maybe you won't always hear that call, but you need to know it's there. And just because you can't see it and you may not hear the call, you can't forget that, maybe that's out there, and you need to gather the things that you need along the way. And so that was sort of the idea of, for me, to kind of reframe this idea of what the calling was, where, hey, just because you're hearing the call doesn't mean it's not time to like leap up onto the mountain immediately.
Right.
But you also, sometimes there's also the time of preparation for your family, preparation for yourself. And, I felt like God was being faithful to me by showing that to me, but also kind of giving me the message that as I drove back into the trees that, hey, I won't always be feeling it as loudly as I am now, but I was receiving that for the urgency of now, but it was something for later. So maybe inelegantly put, but it was a very...
No, that was great. That's I think an extremely relevant kind of thing to be testing or checking for. It's great.
Well, and then it actually has kind of a fleece-like quality in this story, in the sense that you're in motion and you're asking for clarity, and you're saying, God, what? And then you have this moment and this kind of this time with God where you're like, okay, something. So you'll actually be drawing on that, and the Holy Spirit will be able to bring that up in your, just put that up on your radar in the future, when you're in a future moment when you're going to need reminding. Like, I'm not crazy. We made this decision with this clarity, and then now we're down in the trees and we're kind of flailing around, and the Lord will just remind you of that time on the mountain. It's like, that's when we clarified this. That's
right.
Go back to that clarity and operate out of that place. So it's very much the kind of fleece dimension that we're talking about here.
So that when God says, get rid of 80% of your army or 90% of your army before you go into battle, you're actually at a point where you can link back to the confirmation that you got to say, okay, I'm going to do it, even though it feels terrifying. We're going to go about it this way, even though that seems irrational or scary.
So I think this is really relevant for me right now. I'm well, on multiple levels. Like in Dandelion Seed, I definitely am getting called into something larger, which is our arts organization for Matthew. I think you might be the only one who doesn't know what Dandelion Seed is. But so I think, wow, yeah, just opening up the whole story, Justin. And again, I mostly watched the front end of what you shared on the video or whatever. I think that the challenge I have is like taking the principles, and then like our lives are so not like this really condensed, amazing battle story that Gideon went through in like a very short period of time, where it's just like bam, bam, bam. And then it was like all done or whatever. And sometimes I think this feels like another round of kind of a thread of calling that I have been around with God like a bunch of times. And it includes seasons of just wandering through wildernesses about it. So it's like, even so, an interesting tie-in with what you just shared, Matthew, about a mountain. We have this among some friends in DSC, we have this idea or phrase of like, we're trying to climb this mountain and you just have to find another way up the mountain. Like you tried one inroad and you just, that persistence of like, I heard God say something about this, I'm going to keep showing up for it, even when it apparently is not working the way I thought it would. I think I'm in a season of sort of receiving new infusions of faith where it's like, yes, this is still worth trying. And yeah, that believing that God will show up in the ways that he has and throughout history or whatever. So I think it's really personal and really like raw in certain ways for me. So, and I think as I've leaned into that, I forget what, Jonathan has this idea called the trust transfer, where you take, like, you trust God in one area and then you sort of put it out to him in another area. Like, I'm going to trust you to show up in this other way that, I think it's another thing of like just validating that testing is okay on some level, or questions are okay on, with God. And so I'm just kind of leaning into all of those things and trying to hear and just be open. But I think when you do that more intentionally, it's like you create little windows where you actually can see God at work more. Whereas if you're like just going through hard things and you don't make space to pause or ask those questions, then you just don't hear anything and you feel much more isolated and alone in a way. So all of this has been helpful handles on that process right now.
That's
so
awesome.
And your experience, Amber, you're in Nate's journey also. You talk about, kind of being on this journey. That's in juxtaposition to the other approach, which is we're going to wait until we're sure we've got it all right, and have it figured out and be clear and be able to tick off all the boxes on our list before we do anything. And that's really where a lot of people spend a lot of their lives. And you and Nate have been out there, hacking through the underbrush and carving out a trail in the direction of what you understand, and in some remarkable ways. For yes, it has been years, but you've been doing it. You've been out there doing it in some and it's that thing of being in motion. I mean, think one of the themes that Justin really unpacks in this story in those other videos is how much of this process has to do with what God does in Gideon and who Gideon becomes in the process. That it's not just about the call, like Adam was saying, the doing call. It's who are you? It's the thing that you're becoming in the process. And I mean, think of you guys before you launched into this versus now. Just the movement in your own identity and your own sense of who you are, and even I would say, I mean, I'm no expert, but your skill sets and all the things you understand about so many dimensions of stuff because you've been in motion, and God's been meeting you as you've been in motion. So that I see so many of those dimensions in your journey, even though it has been perhaps long and drawn out.
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of that in our DSC community in general. Like, people have been hacking away at things long enough now that there's some learnings amidst the whole that really are starting to add up in significant ways, which is exciting. I also thought this tied in with Charlene's article she posted about, was it 70 or 60% done or whatever, and is good enough, and sort of that you say yes because you're in a direction. And it also ties in with that idea of startups iterating and that you just keep going and you learn as you go. And I do feel like that is resonating with just God showing up as we go. and lean into that. Although I also feel like you make some flamboyant mistakes doing that sometimes.
Yeah.
Know, some big costs that come into play, but there's a lot of cost with sitting around too. So,
because one of the things that I think it just continually struck me as I was looking through all of this is just that sense that thinking about call this way is super helpful to me, because it brings the freedom to kind of the fail forward idea when it comes, because this is an area where usually the way it's discussed in the church, these things are really loaded, and it really taps into sort of our identity or our sort of approval or our standing with God. You know, it's not even just like and a lot of times if you take it from this is this cool idea I have to this is a call that God has given me, all of a sudden that like ratchets up a lot of things. And so for me, getting to put it back in that level of like, ultimately this is still about me and God, him engaging me relationally. Who am I becoming? How are we connecting? And sort of what happens is the outgrowth of that stuff. The end result is the outgrowth of those things. For me, it was just really comforting, because it just brings it back around to that identity question of, am I accepted because I can figure out the plan? I can figure out, am I accepted in the family because I'm good at executing plans and good at, like, God knows I'm a pinch hitter, and when a call needs to get played out, he can pull me off the bench, and that's why I'm in? Or am I accepted because he's chosen me and that's enough? And it's not about a track record thing. To me, was very like helpful to bring that idea of, no, it still is a call in the sense that the sovereign God of the universe is saying, hey, partner with me, let's do this thing together. And it's important stuff. Like, calls are rarely like, you know, little piddly, like, you know, Adam and Matt and Amber, all three of you guys, as you're sharing, like, there's some weight to the stuff you guys are evaluating and the things that you're talking about, but it's still being able to put that back in the sense of, this is not about me proving anything or, you know, securing my place in the family or, you know, reproving myself in some way. That's not what's going on here. For me, it's just really confirming and encouraging to be able to put this, yes, it's a weighty thing, but it's still a weighty thing under the covering of the fact that it's my daddy who wants to, you know, engage with me in a new way now than we did before. And, you know, now it's time to learn how to ride a bike. You know, we did the walking thing. Now we're going to do the bike thing. But it's still like, it's okay if you fall off. It's okay if you get scared. All that stuff is fine, because it's just part of that relational process that he's continuing to invite us into.
I have two brief comments. Just Matt and Amber. Matt, when you guys are sharing about the not riding off in the sunset and coming back and joining the real world or whatever it is, it's something in you saying that, and then also with Amber, when Doug was talking about you hacking through the woods and the decisions you're making anyway, and both of you, that, man, inside me, I just felt like, yes, like, you guys got to do this thing. Anyway, that was one reflection. Another reflection, Amber, one thing you said really briefly, but I would love to hear more, maybe on L3 or in a blog, or I don't know how you would unpack it, but Doug was relating you and Nate kind of hacking through the woods and slogging it through. And you did this really subtle thing where you said, I can't remember the exact words you said, but it was like, my journey is just a mirror or just a model of a whole lot of other journeys that are surrounding us. And you kind of did this subtle jujitsu move, which is, it was just really strong leadership of lowering yourself that others might look, you know, might take higher places, or I don't know. There's just something in that subtle comment. I would love to hear you unpack more and do a deep dive on that heart posture of Doug kind of honoring you for your journey, and then you kind of did this. And there's other people on this journey too. I don't know, just something about that.
Well, just identifying that kind of the whole journey as a community, kind of that larger sense that that you've been together in something, and you recognize that your journey is part of a larger communal kind of growth process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Danny. That's great observations.
Yeah, thanks. I will think about that.
Okay, well, it's on the hour. We're an hour from when we started, so I want to respect everyone's time. And I know you.
I just want to make an observation. I think Matt and Joanna are kind of doing like this Blair Witch Project video thing. You know, like, yeah, it's like we need some. Yeah, we need some a soundtrack to go with them as they're trekking through the wilderness.
You have to drop your phone and then run away, so we only see your feet.
I'm so scared right now. But yeah, we're trying to put the kids to bed. We were we're camping right now, and so we were. Suddenly, Joanna was like, "Where are the kids' sheets?" And I was like, "Oh crap, they're over at the laundromat." So sorry to take you on the journey.
Great. Thank you guys for joining us anyway, and even though you're not in the best of circumstances. That's awesome.
Oh, I think camping is the best of circumstances. So, au contraire, my friend.
Well, for internet connection purposes, but
yeah. It was great to meet all of you. Thank you for including us.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. Cool. All right, guys. Well, just to as we conclude I'll just give the final exhortation that our hope is always that these conversations are not kind of bookended. Oh, yeah, we got on, we talked, that was nice. But like, because I feel like I could keep going. I have 3 other things or 4 other things. I throw out other questions. I would love to hear people unpack more of just and maybe after you've had a chance to go through the videos in more detail, because there's some even other nuances in the exact kind of what are those processes and the rhythms that are embedded in that story. I'm finding it super encouraging and really informative to hear people say like, well, here's how I'm seeing that apply to where I'm at right now. Or maybe here's how I'm seeing that apply to this season that I went through 10 years ago, but looking back on it now in light of this, here's how I'm seeing that in some fresh ways. Other things I think would be really interesting. So this is one narrative from scripture, and I've just done some really loose looking and thinking and starting to see how, does this model really work? Does it carry water if you lay it against other narratives in scripture, other people's stories, not just Gideon's, and starting to see, I think it does, but I would love to hear, that's another thing I would find really interesting, to hear some ongoing thoughts and conversations. So if this is interesting to anybody and you want to go and look at the story of another biblical character and say, like, let me take this kind of model. Are there different, illustrations of some of the principles that like, what is the scripture trying to tell us about what it looks like for real human beings to engage God in a journey of accomplishing a thing and pursuing something? Because there's tons of stories about that in scripture where that happens. I would find it really interesting to hear from some of you guys and other people as well who are just maybe watching the recording. What are you seeing about how this compares and overlays or doesn't overlay on other stories in scripture? And I'm sure that there's other things as well. So just to say, just because the month is technically wrapping up and we're going to be moving on to some other stuff in the content channel, by no means does that mean the conversation needs to end. Please don't let it end. Continue to let this percolate and inform and catalyze your thinking and your learning and your growth. That's kind of the whole point.
And just at a very practical level, just an encouragement. If you haven't gotten through all of the videos, I'd encourage you to do that, or all of the audio recordings. They're each excellent, and they really do continue to unpack the process in a really helpful and useful way, even for someone like myself who's been through the story many times and preached on it before. Lots of good stuff there. So I encourage you to go back and take that in if you haven't had a chance to do that.
Yeah. So, but we will wrap up the call for tonight there. Like I said at the beginning, keep you guys open for some new stuff happening in June. There's going to be some new people coming in, Culps being an example. And we're going to be doing some more coordinated activity type things that will be a good opportunity for you to invite people to, invite friends to. Really, starting in June, we're really pushing to kind of open the L3 up to be more than just a smaller GDI community thing, but broaden that out. So wanting to create cool, free, more public opportunities for you guys to invite friends. Say, hey, this thing that I'm a part of, I think you'd really dig it. They're doing this, 5-day focus on yada, 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 and you can just sign up right here and you'll get all that stuff. And I'd love to go through that with you and maybe open up some engagement in our relationship around some of that stuff. So keep your eye out for that. That'll be happening in June. Also in June, we will be beginning to roll out the first set of Catalyst groups. We've gotten questions from different people about that. A lot more specific detail will be coming out in the next couple of weeks by video and email. But if you're listening to this recording and you've been kind of asking those questions or wondering what it would look like for you to get plugged into a group of people sharing life together, doing SEA, so support, encouragement, and accountability in a consistent way, and walking together and growing together around some processes, we're going to be rolling some of those out in June as well. So keep your eyes peeled for information on that front also. But that's everything I can think of, Dad, in terms of just basic logistics as we're wrapping up, unless you can think of anything else. Sweet. All right. Thank you guys so much for being here, making the time. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and look forward to next month's call. Good night, everybody.